Hi, everyone. My name is Albert. I'll just go with the first name because my last name tends to scare people a little bit. Um, I'm a PhD student at the Scott Polar Research Institute, and I will be speaking to you about naming, categorization, and framing. Um, I hope it's not too boring of a topic with all these natural science and engineering things going around. Um, but I think it's also an important topic to cover. Maybe some of you have already thought these thoughts before, and I don't claim to be terribly original and novel in thinking them through. But my motivation to submit for this conference came from reading the call for papers, where in the abstract, or the summary of the call for papers, which was 105 words, there were three different ways of referring to the same idea. There was Arctic Repair will delve into innovative climate engineering techniques. Then there was the conference will focus on Arctic climate solutions. And then there are engineering interventions. So three different ways, roughly referring to the same idea. And then there is, of course, the idea of climate repair itself. Jason already asked the question yesterday after the movie, what is climate repair? On the website of the Center for Climate Repair, the mission is threefold: to reduce, to remove, and to refreeze, collectively naming this repair. For the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, repair is one of the four categories next to reduce, remove, and resilience. And then Operatio Arctis, some of whom are in the audience today as well, in their Arctic Endgame, they have again a different way of referring to repair: the deliberate measures that are taken to prevent the adverse consequences of global warming. Climate repair is also an attitude and a starting point for action. And climate repair techniques can be divided into three different categories. So it's a lot. Asking what are we talking about, then do we refer to an ambition or an intent, an idea or a concept, specific technologies, or groups of technologies? So I'm not here to criticize. I'm also guilty. I'm working on the previously mentioned UArctic Climate Interventions project. I'm also starting, as Cody mentioned earlier already with the poster presentation, working on a project for areas exploring climate cooling project. And in my PhD, I use mainly climate engineering, but also other terms. So it's a bit messy. My argument, however, is therefore not to criticize, but more to point to the importance of thinking through critically naming, categorization, and classification. They are never perfect, but their adequacy depends on the proposed aims and uses of those terms. The second point, moving on from there, will be that previous understandings of geoengineering work less well in the context of the Arctic. It's difficult to say how we should move forward, and this should be a collective conversation, but I do think we need to think more clearly and perhaps find a bit more agreement about how we speak about these things. And I thought I would have a little bit longer to speak, but I will focus on a couple of reasons why this is important for especially focusing on the role of public engagement that has been highlighted before. But to give you a very brief overview, many of you will have known this already, but the overarching frame that is often referred to, climate repair, is maybe synonymous in some sense to geoengineering, which has been around for quite a while. Most of the definitions of geoengineering have, however, not moved so much forward from the traditional Royal Society understanding. Here, this Shepherd et al. Paper, the deliberate large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment to counteract anthropogenic climate change. Also, people who are very much opposed to, well, very much opposed, but the non-use agreement language is broadly similar. There is a recent change that I personally find very interesting, and that is the way that it's defined in the bans that have been passed in US states of Tennessee and Florida, where geoengineering is defined a little bit differently. But apart from this one or two lines about the large-scale intervention into a climate system, most importantly, geoengineering in the past has been subdivided into two categories, SRM and CDR. Now, I can talk a long time about their development ever since, but still people often refer to SRM and CDR, and geoengineering then being a form of climate action that is separate from mitigation and adaptation. About a decade ago, many people speculated and thought through the implications of this conceptualization. Hayward, for example, said concepts cease to be helpful when they are too broad or too vague, and geoengineering is one such concept. So she instead suggested having 5 different categories to think about. Boucher et al., from a more technical understanding, were also thinking that this is too vague and ambiguous, and they wanted more specificity. So they had this kind of a schema with nice acronyms. Other understandings of geoengineering have also definitely been proposed. James Fleming's interesting but also opinionated book about the history of geoengineering includes famously weather modification, and people like Jeroen Omen and Martin Meiske wanted to include macro-scale engineering also as a part of geoengineer. So that as a very rough overview, the idea of the name geoengineering for the term has been disappearing somewhat from conversations. Climate repair is one of the new ways of describing it, climate engineering, climate intervention, all the terms that I mentioned earlier as well. It's mainly because geoengineering comes with a lot of baggage already. However, when thinking about new terms, those also come with a lot of baggage, which are sometimes not so explored. They come with frames and metaphors. For example, climate restoration is more closely related to ecology in a public understanding, and engineering is more mechanical for many people. Also with a different kind of logic, where interventions implies that we're in an emergency and that we need to do something in that emergency, while management focuses on an element of control. Now, many of these reflections in the past and in the present are mainly focusing on SRM. Specifically, stratospheric aerosol injection is the big idea as their departure point. My argument is that in the Arctic and polar regions in general, this especially works not so well. You don't need to take my word for it. Wikipedia gives a third category when you look at geoengineering. It's not just carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management, but also glacial geoengineering. And on a more serious note, there's also been scholarship about this. Several papers, for example, John Moore's paper on targeted geoengineering. In the Arctic, you have several, and in the polar regions, you have several proposals, several techniques that would be relatively localized in their in how they would be deployed, and also in the potential side effects they would have, and therefore get into a very different kind of conversation and rationale and logic. So there's also been many different kind of subdivisions again. So Ted Parson has spoken about radical adaptation in the context of Antarctica. You have refreezing technologies, glacial and basal geoengineering, sea ice management or modification. But to illustrate that, perhaps it's good to see a couple of the projects that are actually being proposed in the Arctic. You will hear much more about them, and there are many people in the room who work on them. There is the idea of sea ice thickening, so you have Arctic reflections and real ice. You have ideas to bring back the mammoth. Lars pushed Sean to propose new ideas to preserve permafrost. Well, this is one of the ideas that has been proposed to preserve the permafrost. There are ideas to make ice more reflective, both on the Arctic sea ice level. That project has recently been halted, and in the mountain glacial context with Bright Ice Initiative. You have the seabed curtain idea, or this is a bit of an older illustration, but it also shows basal drilling and potential removal of water from the bed of glaciers. So all these ideas are hugely different. Some have more in common with adaptation, some more with mitigation, but this general subdivision of geoengineering and then an SRM and CDR doesn't seem to apply to them. So that's one complication. I would also add that for my PhD research, I study geoengineers or climate repairers, or however you would like to call them, in the Arctic. And some of the findings from my research is that also that uh, researchers themselves are also rather ambiguous and switch between terms and framings. There is a big switching between scales. So, would the eventual global benefit of a technology be at the foreground or the potential local benefit? The novelty of the technique. Sean, for example, already mentioned earlier in the conversation with Brendan that sea ice thickening might be seen as continuing on a process that has been used for a while. But then again, do we really need to call it then something like climate engineering, climate repair? So all these questions come up a lot. The naturalness of a technique is something an artificial technical intervention into the climate, or is it just reproducing an already large-scale natural process? Moreover, it was clear that the emergency and the present crisis was a big motivator for many of the researchers to work on this. Um, in that sense, um, and as I mentioned, the emergency metaphor or the emergency framework often includes talking about interventions and crisis. A central aim of many researchers is, moreover, not to mitigate is to mitigate damage, not so much to return and restore. So, when you speak about climate restoration, for example, maybe that term doesn't always fit so well. And finally, what is also very critical, I think, is that for different publics, different languages were used. So, at public engagement venues or in the public media, there is a different language used to describe the same terms. But for lack of time, uh, I can answer any questions at the later point as well. What to do about this? Because it's kind of, for me, it seems at least kind of obvious that it would be good to have a bit more clarity around terms and classifications and names. Um, I don't know the answer to this. I wrote down a couple of things that could be useful moving forward. Firstly, what is our aim in defining a term? What are the underlying norms, value judgments, and political choices? What is the aim in the sense of, do we aim to describe technical clarity as the Boucher paper wanted, a very neat technical fitting together of pieces? Or is it more that we want to communicate to policymakers or the public? I also think there should be more critical reflections around the broader frames and metaphors that come with specific words. Are these techniques like artificial trees? Is an intervention like chemotherapy, or is it a plan B? What are the logics that are implicit in some of these terms and the actions that come with them in a rhetorical sense? And the last part of my presentation, I wanted originally to expand this a little bit. But who benefits from this clarity? Well, of course, it's the researchers. I'm a human geographer, polar scientist, a kind of SDS scholar. It's been broadly documented that the way that researchers think about and imagine their research clearly influences the way that technology is then developed and shaped and given a place in society. Policymakers and governance initiatives would also, of course, benefit from clarity. Are techniques more like things that we already know, or are they new, and should new governance frameworks be introduced? But what I mainly want to focus on, and Cody also already mentioned our new project, and we have a poster as well, is public understanding and public engagement. A week ago, we did our first scoping trip to Iceland, and it was really clear how people, depending on the frame they gave the technology, they connected it to very different topics. Is it like salmon, artificial salmon farming, or is it like tree planting? A bit more transparency, so a bit more clarity around what terms are used would be hugely beneficial to build public trust, to be able to give free prior informed consent by communities, to have transferability between different contexts, both in geographical sense and different projects. It will add to stability over time, and it will allow the building of partnerships almost out of time. So just rushing through the conclusions, there's a proliferation of terms used to refer to the same ideas or groups of techniques. All these terms come with their own associations and logics. Several Arctic techniques fall outside of previous categorization. There is no perfect solution. However, it is important, and I think this is a great venue for that, to think more clearly and get together to be more clear about what we do and why we do it. So here are some references. My email address, I spent the last half year in North America visiting various Cambridges there, but from now on I will be mostly in this Cambridge, so if you want to find me, I'm at the Scott Polar Research Institute. So thank you.